Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Barry Beckham. The subject here is a Photoshop subject. But if you're viewing on YouTube, can I ask you to consider subscribing to my channel? And if you hit the notification bell, then you'll be informed whenever I put up a new video. The subject for this video is outdoor photography like landscape and seascapes. This may be a slightly longer intro than I'd like, but if you could bear with me, I'll be grateful. Now I'm generalizing here just a little bit, but when we see Photoshop videos on YouTube, the ones with the most views are often those that have the widest difference between the starting image and the finished image. These videos often include a statement that says something like 5 hidden Photoshop sliders are going to be revealed to you, as if Adobe would spend millions in development only to hide their efforts from their customers. Now I'm sorry to disappoint, but I think you already know this anyway, but there are no hidden secrets. And most of the time, the reason for the wide difference between the starting image and the final one is that the original image has been exposed to the right, and it's that technique which creates the difference between the two. For those who are not familiar with this term, exposed to the right refers to the histogram, the light tones being on the right. Simply put, exposed to the right means squeezing as much light into the sensor as we possibly can, but without going so far that the highlights are then completely overexposed. So the obvious questions we may ask are, why do we do this? When should we do this? And what is the result? Why do we do it? Because image editing works much better from a quality point of view when we edit our images from lighter tones towards darker ones. We don't make the noise worse, which is what we would do if we tried to do it the other way around, lighten heavy shadow areas as an example. The technique allows greater flexibility from a creative editing point of view as well, and in many cases it'll speed up the process too. When should we expose to the right? Well, it could be any time, but in contrasty conditions it can often be vital. It allows us to capture maximum light into those dark shadows, which, as I've said, results in a better quality image. Bracketing of exposures is one of the routes to this technique. What is the result of exposure to the right? It's an image that at first glance looks overexposed and weak in tone. It lacks contrast, colour, and therefore appeal. But that's due to the exposure to the right technique. Unfortunately, the image isn't going to wow you when you first see it on the LCD on the back of the camera, or as a thumbnail in Adobe's Bridge or Lightroom. But not only are all the ingredients there for a quality image, the gap between high contrast levels that we struggle to bridge is being constantly reduced by the development and improved tools in Photoshop and Lightroom. Here's an example. We've seen this image in my introduction, and it does tell us quite a bit about exposure and how the camera deals with high contrast. By the way, I have the red clipping highlight warning turned on to show the lost detail. This image has been given 1.3 stops more exposure than the camera wanted to give, and that was done to squeeze as much light into those shadows as possible, to lessen the impact of high contrast. And the effect on the sky, of course, is obvious, but it's redeemable. Look at the image we would have had if we'd allowed the camera to determine the exposure. In fact, it's in these conditions where the exposure is even more critical. hence the usual advice to bracket exposures. We couldn't have given any more exposure in these conditions because that would have destroyed the sky completely. And the sky is about 70% of the appeal of this image. In fact, we're very close here to requiring 2 different exposures to cope with the contrast difference. And in fact, I did take 3 bracketed shots. But unfortunately, I took them handheld for reasons I now cannot recall, and Photoshop is unable to align the images as it normally can. So this is the image we're going to work through. To speed up the process, I've already gone into the optics down at the bottom right of the screen. I've ticked the box to fix chromatic aberration and also the lens corrections. So let's begin by looking really at the bottom half first and not worry too much about that sky. I'd like to give it a little more warmth, so I'm going to go up to my temperature and give it a little bit. It lacks colour, but then of course the exposure to the right will take away a lot of the colour, and we're going to get quite a bit back as we go through the manipulations. Next stage I think is to go down to the clarity slider, because I know if I step it halfway along to the right, that's going to put quite a bit of definition into the rocks. But given the exposure here, it would be nice if I didn't have to increase the shadows, but I think I only need to increase it a little bit down at the bottom left corner, so I think that's going to be acceptable under the circumstances, about midway maybe. And there we can see that's looking quite nice. Maybe I'll just tweak the vibrance a little bit as well, just to increase that colour a little more. Now that doesn't look too bad, but of course the next thing we've got to look at is that sky. Well, I think what we'll do here is apply a graduated filter. So from the right hand side of Adobe Camera Raw, this is 2020 version of course, I'm going to select that. I'm going to draw a line just across the horizon, starting, well, you'll see, from the green dot to the red dot, something like that. And what I'm going to do is to drop down the exposure and the highlights. Let's take some of the highlights and we'll see a lot of that clipping warning disappear. But we've still got quite white areas here, which hopefully we can deal with a little later. Again, I think I may jump down to the clarity because that always looks pretty good with cloudscapes and sky, but I do need to bring down the exposure. I may want to tweak the blacks down. I'm trying to put quite a bit of impact into that sky. But you see, once we start to do that, we start to create 1 or 2 problems. If you look up at the extreme top right, and by the way, there's a few dust spots there, which I think I'll deal with those in Photoshop. That top corner is a little too dark for me. Now what we can do in Adobe Camera Raw, and all that I'm doing here can be done in Lightroom of course, is to use a brush to remove some of the impact of the graduated filter that I've just applied. To do that, I'm going to pick up my brush and I'm going to select the eraser because I want to lessen the impact. I do like to see the size, the feather and the flow. You'll notice I keep my flow down very low. I think that's the important part here. The size of the brush, well, we can increase that with the square bracket keys on the keyboard, but I just want to wipe over that top corner just a couple of times, and that's all I really feel the need to do. It just balances that up a little bit. But now I'm drawn to the left corner because that's a little bit weaker than the right corner, so why don't we add another graduated filter there. So I'm going to go up to this option to just click it to take us away from the brush and bring us back to the graduated filter. Because I'm going to go up to the extreme top left, click and drag. Now the effect of that's rather strong. So if we right click within the bounding box, we can reset that. I'm also going to touch the V key just to hide that bounding box, because if we come back over to the right hand side, I just want to drop the exposure down so that I get a reasonably nice balance between the right corner and the left corner. And I think I'm more or less happy with that. Now we need to come back away from the graduated filter. We can do that by going to the top right of the screen and clicking up here. But a shortcut for that is just to touch the Z key. Now sometimes I found it's quite a benefit to walk away from an image part way through the manipulation. Not always possible, I know. But sometimes when we come back just a few moments later, we do see things that we don't see when we're in full creative flow. As I've come back and looked at this after leaving my room just for a few minutes, I'm looking at the lightness along the edge of the tree line, and it looks a little bit unnatural there. I don't mind this area being quite dark. I think that's quite natural given the contrast. But maybe I could do something about that using exactly the same technique as we used at the top right corner. Now, if we do want to go back, what we've got to do is reselect our gradient filter at the top there, so we can do that over at the top right of the screen. When we do, we need to come, and because we've got two of them now, we've got to click the pin to make this one active. Then I can go back to my brush and my eraser, and I've dropped my flow down to 2. I want to drop it down even less than before, which was about 4, I think. Now with the brush around about that sort of size, I'm going to hit the V key just to hide that selection for a moment. I'm just going to wipe over this area just a little bit, just to try to take the hint of that away. Not much, but just a little. Attention to detail, I feel, is always important. Small steps, which we don't notice in themselves, but of course when we've made 10 small steps, they tend to add up to a rather big one. The more I look at my image, the more I feel I've got a little bit of a weakness right in the center of the sky. So let's use the circular filter for that. So way over to the right hand side, just underneath the graduated filter is the circular filter. And I'm going to click and drag. I can click inside and move it around. I can use the toggles here to position it to any place I want. Long and thin I think will work for me. I'm going to touch the V key again. I'm a great believer in that to get rid of the bounding box. So as I drop the exposure just a little bit, the bounding box is not getting in my way. Doesn't need to come down very much, just about to there I would suggest. I'll touch the V key again and back comes the bounding box. So I'm going to touch the Z key and I'm going to sit back and just take a couple of minutes to decide what else I need to do. One area that keeps drawing my attention is the blue of the sections of the sky where we can see blue. Because of my manipulations, I've rather spoilt the colour there a bit. Well, maybe we could have a go at that with an adjustment brush. I think what I'll do with my zoom tool is just click and drag to get that sky, that large area, fairly large to work on. Then if we go over to the right hand side and select the brush, we've got the same sort of options here, the size of the brush, which we can adjust using the square bracket keys on the keyboard. The feather is set well high, my flow is set down to around 4. So what I'm going to do here is just wipe along there to create the pin, and I'm going to drop the temperature down. I'm going to take a guess somewhere around there, and now I'm just going to wipe over this area. Now that seems to be working a bit too fast, so I'm going to go back to the flow and drop that down to 2, just so I can take a bit more care here. And as you can see, we can adjust the size of the brush, and I'm working a little bit quick and dirty here for speed, but I would normally reduce the size of the brush and go in between the clouds a little bit. But there you can see it's not too difficult. I'll do that over here, holding the space bar, clicking and dragging. So I can just release a little bit more of the blue through there. You get the idea, and it's just going to take a few seconds to go over these, and you can see, because we've got a soft edge and because we're not making massive changes here, it's very forgiving on what we're actually doing. So I'll just finish off those little bits of blue, then I'll hit Ctrl 0 to fit the image back fully on screen. Now I think I've reached the time when I'm ready to open this image up into Photoshop and do the finishing touches, but if you look down at the bottom right corner of the screen, you'll notice that it says Open Object. What I've got turned on via the hyperlink at the center base is the Smart Object status. Here it is down here. What it means is I can open this image up into Photoshop, but if I want to come back into Camera Raw at any time, I'm free to do so and make changes, any changes to what I've already done here. So let's open this up into Photoshop. Now with the image open up into Photoshop, I'll remind you that of course we do have access to all the work we've done here through Adobe's Bridge, but now I also have the same sort of access through the Smart Object. I don't think I'm going to need to go back into Adobe Camera Raw, but it's always nice to have a layer there just in case. But for what I want to do next, I can't work on a Smart Object, so I'm going to hit Ctrl J to make a copy of that layer. Then I'll right click and rasterize it. It just turns it back into a standard layer, because what I've got to do next is to deal with the highlights in the sky here. Let's start off fairly gently. I've got my lasso tool selected. Let's take that piece of sky down there to start with. Once I've got a selection made, we need to go to our edit menu, top left of the screen, and content aware fill. Now we get two windows here. This one we're sampling from, this one is going to be showing us the result. So I just need to use the painting tool here. You can see the plus, if I can say it, in the center of the ring. And if you look up at the top left of the screen, you can see the tool that I've selected. Now we can do a bit of experimentation here, because anything we can paint, we can remove. So let's just paint alongside in that part of the sky, because it looks as though it may be reasonable to make a repair on the right. And I hope you'll agree that we've got a pretty good repair here. I'm going to take this one stage at a time. So if you look down at the output here, it says a new layer. So when I click OK, Photoshop puts the repair on this layer, so I can turn it on and off. But if I'm going to move on and do a repair of another area, then it might be a good idea, once I'm happy with this, to merge these two layers together, particularly as the repair I've just done is quite close to the large area above. So I think I may do that. I'll select both of them, right click and choose merge layers. It will just merge those two, not this one here. So what I'm going to do is hit Ctrl D to remove that selection. Hold the spacebar, click and drag, because I've now got to decide if I'm going to tackle all of that main sky here in one go. Well, I'm going to give it a try, because you've seen that it outputs it to a new layer, so we've got nothing to lose here whatsoever. So let's have a look at, say, from this area. I'll go down and around and up. Maybe I'll just take, I'm gonna see the little plus there. If you look up at the top left of the screen, you can see an icon is checked. That adds one selection to another. So as an afterthought, I think I'll just loop that part in. So let's go to Edit, Content Aware Fill. Let's move this around. We can reduce the size here at any time. So if I want to hit the zoom tool, I've got the zoom here in minus, so I can click a couple of times so I can see a bit more of the sky, which may be useful. But now back to the tool. So now I've got to decide where I'm going to take the sample from. Now we've got streaks in the sky and there's streaks here, so I'm going to paint and say to Photoshop, see what you can do with that. Well, that doesn't look too bad, does it? We've got a little bit of repetition here and here, but nothing we couldn't fix. That doesn't look like a bad repair to me, and I think I'm willing to accept that. So I'm going to click OK to open this up into Photoshop. Hit Ctrl D to remove the selection, and I may give it 1 or 2 touches of the healing brush. So I'm going to go over to the left hand side, and from the toolbox I'm going to select the spot healing brush, I think, and I'll zoom in even a little larger. And I'm looking for the problem in my repair, and now I'm having difficulty in finding it. There it is, that little bit there and that little bit there. So one of those really needs to go. So let me see if I can just paint over that and camouflage that. We've got a couple of other light areas. I think they're not that significant, but as you can see, they're not too difficult to deal with just a click and drag of the paintbrush. We've got quite a long one over here, so I'm going to click, hold the shift key and click. You can see it paints in a straight line, but I can touch it a few times to merge that in. Well, I think you probably got the idea here. We can finish this off and we're more or less done, although there's a little bit of cloning to do in the sky and also removing some of those surfers. If the surfer was up on his board and in a prominent spot, then of course it would be worth keeping, but all they are is just a distraction in the water. So I'm going to finish off the sky exactly as I've done here, and then I'm going to remove the surfers. But I think what I will do next is to merge these 2 layers together, select them both, right click and merge layers, hit Ctrl 0 and move on from here. So the finishing touches to this image I can do with the healing brush, but as a failsafe we can always create a new blank layer. This is just a personal choice, and as long as you select sample all layers from the top of the screen, then if we zoom in on one of these surfers and we do a little bit of work there, we'll notice that the repair is placed on a new layer. So at least we can check our work and be sure of it before we move on. So I'm going to carry on and deal with all of these. I don't think they're going to be any problem at all. 1 or 2 touches and they'll disappear completely. If necessary, sometimes you may need to switch from the spot healing brush to the healing brush, and sometimes even to the old-fashioned clone tool that still works well, or you could still even try that content aware fill to do even these small areas. It's a matter of choice, really. Now with the spinning round of the screen, I've saved my work in progress and flattened all of the layers down, and you may notice I've relieved some of the colour saturation just a little bit. After looking at the picture for some time, I felt I'd got it a little bit too warm, so I backed away from that. Final stages now, I've removed all of the surface, as you can see. I'm going to go to my image menu, and given the nature of this image, going to go to image size. With the chain link here unlinked from the width and the height, I'm going to add about 400 pixels to just the width. So I'll make that 6000, and it just gives us a little bit more of a panoramic look to seascapes and landscapes. So here I'm showing you now the original untouched image. And it's not difficult really when you think about it to go from something like this to what we've just created. And of course the massive difference between the two is really been caused by the fact that we exposed to the right, which made the original image look weak, pale and uninteresting, but all the ingredients were there to create an image with some impact. Once we have a well-balanced image, then of course we can look at derivatives. I'll see you next time.